Okay, so yeah, thanks a million, Pete, for the introduction. Really appreciate it, and thank you also to you for organizing what looks to be shaping up to a fantastic Azure Management event. So my name is Kevin Green. I'm a Microsoft MVP in the cloud and data center space. I'm pushing nearly 10 years in the program, so 10 amazing years, made a lot of friends and a lot of really good contacts. I work for an IT services and managed service provider over here in Dublin, Ireland, called Ergo Group. And if you're looking to contact or connect with me on social media, you can catch me at kgreenit on Twitter, or you can hit me up on my LinkedIn, simply just kgreenit at the usual LinkedIn URL. Right, so we have a good bit of content to get through, so I'm going to kick off and just make sure, Pete, can you see my my slides okay? Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Okie dokes. Right, so today's agenda, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why maybe you or your organization would like to migrate to Microsoft Azure. We're delivering a lot of migration projects for our customers over the past few years, and we've pretty much hit most of the scenarios and drivers that customers hit when they want to talk about migration to any cloud platform. I'll talk then about some Azure migration strategies. So we're aligning with the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for their Azure migration strategies, but I'll also give you a kind of an insider view as some sample processes that we use in Ergo that we've just found useful for us as we've gone through various migration projects over the years. Once you get your workloads up into the cloud, it's super, super important that you can actually manage them. That's what this event is about. It's about Azure Management. So I'll talk to you and show you some tips and tricks around optimizing those workloads, super importantly, managing the costs. So there's a really cool feature of Azure called Azure Cost Management. And then also, of course, you need to understand about how to monitor, how to govern, how to back up, all of the usual kind of management capabilities and scenarios that you would have with your on-premises workloads. You still need to consider those in this new cloud-based platform. So why migrate? So a number of reasons. So it could be simply a data center contract expiry. So you could be with an existing on-premises data center provider. Your contract is coming up for renewal, and maybe it's just the cost implications and the flexibility of moving to a cloud platform or a public cloud platform. Maybe acquisitions. So we've had a few customers who are quite large, and their business model now is acquisition to enhance growth. So anytime a company acquires an existing company, there's all sorts of technical challenges and hybrid technologies and platforms that have to be considered. So consolidating them quickly into a cloud platform is a really cool driver and useful driver to move up there. Urgent capacity needs. How many times have you either in your own organization, or if you're in the consulting world like me, had customers who constantly hit blockers on things like storage space? So, we need a bunch of new VMs spun up or a bunch of new workloads, and all of a sudden it can't be happening because they need to get more disks for their SAN or whatever, or maybe they've no rack space left. So again, you've got the flexibility and scalability of the cloud. Software and hardware refresh. So, maybe you've got a bunch of hardware on premises, like, as I said, SANs or physical tin servers, and the support is up. So typically it's anywhere between 3 and 5 years is the typical support runner for workloads for physical tin. So it could be an opportunity just to assess the costs and move from that kind of on-premises CapEx model to an OpEx model where you're essentially paying for what you consume instead of just buying in bulk over the number of years. Of course, security threats. And I know Pete has done an awful lot on security, and we've got some really good speakers coming up later on today to tell their war stories about security. So no matter how diligent you or your IT organization are with security, unless I guess you're working in maybe some sort of super secret government organization, There's no guarantee that you're going to have the security levels and the certifications that the big public cloud vendors have. So if you or your business are super intuitive about security, well, you're not really going to get much more secure than something like Microsoft Azure. Compliance, again, in a similar vein, if you don't have the right compliance, whether it's your workloads or customer workloads for your on-premises data centers, then there's no point in running it properly. So if you put those workloads up into the cloud, you can be fully compliant and aligned with all of the relevant region and country rules and regulations that might adhere to your business. Application innovation. So again, we're talking about, old school virtual machines or physical servers. Maybe a new application is coming up and you don't want to go that traditional kind of infrastructure as a service type model. Well, then you can leverage some of the new technologies in the cloud, like platform as a service or even SaaS workloads for certain areas as well. And then a big one, of course, especially in the last few years, is software end of support. So if your Windows or your SQL or any of those type of licenses are expired or due for expiration or end of life, well then instead of paying Microsoft a pretty sum or a pretty penny to extend that license on an ad hoc basis, why not migrate to the cloud and leverage some of the incentives Microsoft give as well. So speaking about licensing, so I'm still encountering a significant number of customers who have in some way, shape or form Windows 2008 workloads in their on-premises data centers. So that may be Windows Server or it may be SQL Server. And as you can see from the slide here, January this year, support ended for Windows Server. So if your organization has any Windows 2008 or 2008 or 2 Windows servers, they are no longer supported. So if there is a security breach or an exploit that some unauthorized people come across that targets Windows Server 2008 or 2008 or 2, then don't go looking to Microsoft for any additional support unless you want to pay, as I said, a pretty penny to them to get those security updates. Likewise, same story with SQL Server. What Microsoft have announced, that now this is not new, they announced this over a year ago now. What they've announced about a year ago is that if you do want to migrate those workloads as they are, so if there are dependencies on vendors where maybe an application has to run inside a Windows 2008 server and it's just maybe short term, it's just too much hassle to get everyone on board to refactor or replatform that workload, you can lift and shift that in a migration scenario up to Azure, and Microsoft will guarantee they will give you up to 3 years of free security updates after support ends. So for Windows Server, up until January 2023, you will get security updates for that one, and then up to July 2022 for SQL Server as well. So if you've got those type of workloads or your organization do, definitely start thinking about how Azure can help to at least bring them in their current guise, if at worst, up to the cloud. And the next few slides, I'll talk to you about some alternatives if you want to get the application up to Azure, but not necessarily as a legacy 2008 workload. Okay, so any migration strategy or any migration to the cloud rather needs a good strategy. Gone are the days, and I guess most people on this webinar are techies, and gone are the days in our technical careers where we'd be like, oh, new technology, I want to get stuck into that straight away. Strategy goes out the window because I can click through it and I can figure it out pretty quickly, and before you know it, you've got a bunch of POC workloads running in the cloud, and then those POC workloads then suddenly change over to production workloads, and there's no strategy behind it, and really you're on a hiding to nothing if you don't follow through with the right processes and the right people and the right technology. So leaning on the cloud adoption framework, there are a number of different steps or stages in the migration plan. So of course this is for Azure, but regardless of your cloud preference, this strategy should be fairly sound. So if we think of the assessment phase, you obviously need to understand exactly what it is that you have on premises, not just from an Excel sheet or not just from, somebody who's been keeping a manual log of, workloads that are in the Active Directory domain or under the control of the VMware or Hyper-V clusters. You need dynamic, real-time analytics and assessment data, so you can then make a judgment call on whether those workloads are actually ready to be moved to the cloud, or even whether they're cost effective, because not every migration scenario will be cost effective, at least in this point in time for your business. And I say in this point in time because some workloads in Azure, when they start out, some of them can be a lot more expensive than their on-premises counterparts or equivalent. But over time, as that service matures in Azure, you can see it get cheaper and cheaper and become a real factor for moving across without having to consider any additional extra costs on an ongoing basis. So an assessment is super important, and always a component of your strategy that you absolutely need to consider. The migration, of course, that's the actual migration of the workloads. When you've carried out your assessment, then you can go and migrate the workload. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Optimization. So when you have the workloads up there, as I spoke a little earlier, you need to make sure that you can optimize them. So are they the most cost effective running as they are? Do I really need them, as multiple VMs or even single VMs, or can I make it a PaaS workload? There's plenty of different optimization scenarios that you can leverage once it's up in Azure. So you don't just take it, migrate it, forget about it. You really got to ensure that it's lean, it's performing the way it should do in the right region, and that you keep your end users of those applications and those workloads happy as well. So again, another important piece of the strategy. And secure and manage. So of course, you still need to secure your workloads and you still need to manage them. Azure has services for both security and management in spades. And there's, as I said, many different sessions throughout today that you'll see or you'll learn about how to secure your workloads, how to govern them, how to monitor them. There's some really, really cool technologies out there. And, if you manage to review all of the videos, assuming you're not going to stay up through the night, if you're over here in Europe, for example, or down in APAC, where I know Tao has hit the scratcher now at this stage. But if you're going to stay and review these videos over the next few weeks, and you're thinking to yourself, wow, like I really want to get started with Azure. Obviously, this is a getting started session here, but it just seems like there's so much to do. There's so much to learn. It's nearly overwhelming. Well, absolutely. I feel like that every day. I feel like, I'm to use the phrase I've heard quite frequently about Azure, I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose when it comes to all the information and all the data. But once you kind of put those initial worries and fears behind you, you will find that most of your on-premises skills that so if you're pretty good at networking or storage or management or governance on-prem, you can take those skills and that knowledge and you can apply it to all of these new services up in the cloud as well. So once we've got those kind of pillars of your strategy aligned, what you need to do then is you need to think about how, from the migrate phase, how exactly am I going to migrate them? Like, what are those migrations going to look like in what format? And we have the rehost scenario. So this one would be probably the most common one anyway. So it's a lift and shift. It's take your virtual machines or your databases, well, predominantly your virtual machines, take your VMs and literally lift them and move them to the cloud. So it's like a vMotion or a live migration, whatever you want to call it, on-prem. You're essentially doing that, replicating the workload up into Azure, and it exists up there. It will have a different IP address, but other than that, once you've got connectivity back to on-premises, it should operate pretty much exactly, if not better, from a performance perspective than you would have been familiar with on-prem. Refactor is becoming more and more common. So you might look and say, I've got a web application sitting on an IIS server with a backend SQL database in a SQL server. And instead of doing the lift and shift, where you're taking maybe those 2 VMs or whatever number of VMs and lifting and shifting them, you might look and say, how about we leverage the true power of the cloud, and we go platform as a service. So we use something like Azure Application Services or Azure SQL database, or it doesn't have to be SQL, it can be MongoDB, Postgre, whatever. But you can basically take those workloads, strip out all of the hassle and the management of the operating system and the VM and all of that stuff, or even if it's a physical box, you're stripping out the hardware dependency as well, and completely refactoring that application up into a PaaS workload. If we think about the re-architect, and this re-architect refactor can intertwine depending on who you speak to, but from a re-architect perspective, you might look at that application or that workload and decide, you know what, I've heard that containers are cool. Everybody's talking about containers lately, for example. Maybe I want to take my application. I don't necessarily want to go your kind of typical PaaS route, but maybe I want to leverage something like container services, or maybe microservices, serverless. There's plenty of options out there. So that would be a complete re-architect of the application. And now, of course, would be the opportunity to do that. Or you might just want to do a simple rebuild. So rebuild could be, you know what, I've got a legacy application running on a legacy OS. I want to keep running it on an OS, but I want to rebuild it in a new OS, a fully supported one. You could do it that way as well, or you could add in additional high availability options. Plenty of different options to think about. But they would be the most common different migration strategies and scenarios that you would deal with. The biggest request that we've been getting over the past few years, it is changing this year. Thankfully, people's mindsets are definitely coming around to the refactor or the re-architect. But the biggest one, and the one I think that gives people an initial warm, fuzzy feeling about migrating to a cloud platform, is rehost. So it's not, the most modern way of doing things, but if that makes you and your organization feel better, and you've still got that familiarity with a VM just running in a cloud platform instead of on-prem, then absolutely that should be a bare minimum of your strategy for migration. So any migration strategy built on the likes of the assessment, migration, optimization, and security and management, it's only as good as the people that are involved in that specific strategy. So there's no point in just having the techies involved and just get in and take the machines and move them up. You got to involve your finance team. You got to potentially involve your marketing, your sales team, anyone who's affected by those applications or anyone who uses those applications. And I would say put a team together, like the A team or something like that. Just maybe leave BA Baracus out of it, but put a team together. Make sure that you've got all of the relevant stakeholders for the different areas of your business that could or will be affected by a migration to the cloud. And and sit down and work it out. Plan things, understand which workloads are important for people, maybe tier them like gold, silver, bronze in terms of priority or criticality, and then work that into your process and your planning, and ultimately then the technology will follow on behind it. So if you can follow this kind of mantra, obviously adapt it to whatever suits you and your organization, but if you can follow this mantra and this strategy, you cannot go far wrong. It's worked for us for definitely the last few years. Moving on, this is just a sample project engagement model that we use in Ergo for a lot of our migration projects. Some of these steps might vary a little bit depending on the customer or the engagement, but again, probably just some food for thought for any folks that are watching this who think that they don't know where to get started. So collaboration is important. Back to that people and the A team kind of scenario I spoke about in the previous slide. Ensure that you have a collaboration platform. We use Teams internally, or our customers may use Teams. Could also be Slack or whatever. Have somewhere where you can collaborate, and not necessarily just for the techies, because again, the techies will want to use their own tools, and the non-techies like the project managers or maybe the project sponsors on the customer side or on your side may not be too familiar with super technical tooling. So a really useful collaboration platform and engagement to begin with is always a great way to go. After that, then DevOps. So we use Azure DevOps. We will be looking to migrate over to GitHub once that becomes more kind of familiar and more feature rich in comparison to Azure DevOps for us. But ultimately, have a DevOps platform, whatever one it is, where you can share your code. You can store your code in repositories. You can have preferably something like a Kanban board, so you can see all of your work items and your tasks and all of the different areas of the project and the different steps. Again, if possible, you know, with the likes of Azure DevOps, we can integrate that into Microsoft Teams, so our non-techies don't have to get into DevOps. We can create a dashboard in Teams with our DevOps work items, for example, where the non-techies as such can actually see where the techies are in terms of the different steps in the project. And of course, we can control our code, we can put approval gates in here, and we can deploy in a true CI/CD fashion to our customer organizations as well. So that's definitely an important one. And again, it's a fairly new onboarding for us as the majority of us, myself included, in the IT pro space. So, you know, over the last few years, kind of rejigging my mindset and my focus into a DevOps mindset has been a challenge, but it has been really, really fun as well. So once we have the collaboration and the DevOps tooling together, then what we'll do is we'll start working out a high-level landing zone design. And what I mean by landing zone, again, we're aligning to Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework, or the CAF. I don't actually have a link to it here. I'll probably update the deck and stick a link in because I think it's useful before I send it over to Pete. But if you're looking to find out about the Cloud Adoption Framework, just do a quick search in your favorite search engine, and you get a nice, I think, 900-page document where you can dig deep and you can find everything that you need. But what we normally do is we've got our templates and we've got our DevOps artifacts and collateral ready for most of the landing zone designs that we need to consider for our customers, at least from a high level. And the landing zone will be things like the virtual networking. So if there's going to be virtual networking required, things like maybe a hub spoke design, connectivity back to on-prem. So whether you want to use ExpressRoute, VPN gateways, third-party network virtual appliances, Azure Firewall, whatever. We'll kind of spec all of that out, including all the management tooling and all of that kind of repeatable and high-level kind of landing zone design at this point. And we'll then present that back to the customer. So once we do that, then we kick into the assess and discover. So again, you know, super important that you don't just run straight in and assess and discover or start playing with the tech tools before you've got your process. So we'll use the tools. I've got some demos. I'm going to show you how to use Azure Migrate to perform the assess and discover for various workloads. We get the output from the assessment phase, and then we use that output to apply it to what we've already put together from a high-level design. And we get some workshops with the customers or with our customers, and we then formulate or put together a low-level design document. So the low-level design will call out things like the landing zone, but also the relevant workloads, the different tiers of workloads, gold, silver, bronze, as I mentioned, and cost estimates, all that type of stuff. So it's kind of like a manual or a Bible for the customer, so they understand exactly what it is that we're doing, what we've built, and also what it's going to look like, at least from a cost perspective, once it goes up into the cloud. Then at that point, when everyone gives the green light and when everyone's agreed, we actually do the migration, starting in, you know, with the lower tiered application workloads or even dev tests to begin with. Make sure everyone's happy and comfortable with the process. Test it. Super important to test those workloads, and then do the actual migrations, then test again. So that's a fairly straightforward and obvious kind of area that everyone is going to have to follow. If you don't test, you're going to get caught out and something's going to happen. Cost optimization, I've said it several times, super important. You know, make sure that even though you performed an assessment of the workloads, and it will give you a very accurate cost estimate, at least for IaaS workloads, what you need to do is you need to ensure that, you know, using the tools and the automation features built into Azure Cost Management, that the relevant costs are optimized, the relevant design that's been applied is valid, and you've not overspec'd or you've not underspec'd. You know, you've got plenty of tools in Azure that can help out with that. Secure and manage, again, use things like Azure Security Center, Azure Sentinel. If it's third-party tooling that's not even in Azure, that's fine. You know, just whatever you do, just make sure you secure and manage those workloads. Back them up as well. We've got the native Azure backup and some other vendors who have integrated into Azure. Again, they're workloads in the cloud, but they're an extension of your organization on-prem. So you still need to ensure that you secure and manage them as you normally would. And then finally, continuous improvement. So at this point here, we're continuously improving the environment. We're working with our customers to make sure that, you know, what we deployed or what we migrated 6 months ago, is that still relevant? Are you ready? If we migrated a bunch of IaaS workloads as VMs, are you ready to now take it to the next level and move to PaaS or containerization or whatever? So continuously improve. Don't just leave it in the corner like maybe that old Windows 2008 or 2003 server that's sitting in your data center, forgotten about and covered in dust. You know, continuously improve and try and reduce costs and consolidate where possible. That's the flexibility that the cloud gives us. So another point that that I thought might be quite useful is have a risk assessment as part of your migration process. So this is just a sample one that we put together for server migrations. I mean, the questionnaire here is not a de facto everything you should think about, but my point for putting this up is, you know, work through your own questions and your own ideas and figure out what it is that you need to know as, you know, the migration lead in your organization, for example. And make sure that you get sign off from the business that you're migrating. So make sure that you've asked those questions before you do it, because there's nothing worse than migrating some workloads and then finding out, you know, somebody, a developer or somebody else, complains about a particular configuration or scenario. You've not considered it, you've not even asked the question, and then it doesn't work out very well. So you might need to roll back, or then you're firefighting trying to remediate the problem. So have some sort of risk assessment. As I said, this is a sample one that we use, just asking just some various issues or questions around server migration as well. Okay, so Azure Migrate. So for those of you that know or don't know, Microsoft has its own native service for migrating workloads, simply called the Azure Migrate service. And the Azure Migrate service truly is a hub, a centralized hub for data center migration. It wasn't always like that, but you know, it was a little bit piecemeal, and we kind of had to use Azure Migrate for one piece and then another tool, and you know, even though we will use several different tools as part of this journey today, the key factor here is that they all link back in and they all upload and centralize their data inside the Azure Migrate service. So you can control this with your Azure governance, your role-based access control. You can even deploy the Azure Migrate project and workload using your DevOps, your infrastructure as code as well, or your ARM templates as well. So there's plenty of things that you can do with Azure Migrate from a deployment and a control perspective before you even start using it. You're going to have a number of different key migration scenarios, so definitely not just Windows servers. There's going to be integrated discovery, assessment, and migration capabilities. So you've got essentially all in one. There's Microsoft predominantly are going to have most of their workloads and most of their services built into Azure Migrate, but there are a bunch of third-party ISV partner tools that you can also integrate in. The majority of them are not free. I much prefer free, but there can be some scenarios where specific workload types either are not supported, at least yet, with Azure Migrate, or are maybe better managed using a third-party ISV vendor or ISV partner. And at that point, you know what, why not spend the money if it's worthwhile getting a seamless transition to the cloud and then integrating that the data for that into the Azure Migrate hub as such. And then again, it's a centralized repository, so you can come back to it, and if you use it initially for the assessment phase, you can come back to it, you know, in a few weeks or a month or whatever, and you can have a look at assessments that you carried out a while back, and if that workload has changed, you can perform new assessments or you can tweak it. You know, it's that centralized location. It's not just a once-off point in time and you have to completely reinvent the wheel and go through change control processes again with some of the older legacy scenarios that used to be available for assessments in particular. So some of the key migration scenarios for Azure Migrate. So obviously you would expect Windows servers, Linux as well. So, you know, I'm going to demo just Windows here, but if you've got a bunch of Linux servers, not a problem. So that would be your typical lift and shift migration scenario. So you can bring those up. SQL and other databases. So SQL, we've got tools that can assess and migrate your databases. On-premises data as well. So there's tools that we can bring your on-premises data up into Azure Migrate. in chunks, and you can see it. You can get all of that kind of centralized view of the data being brought up. Virtual desktop environments, or VDI. So I think that's relatively new, probably last 6 months, give or take, as a feature. So you can also use Azure Migrate as the hub to begin moving or migrating your virtual desktop environment up into the cloud if you so wish. And web apps as well. So web applications, like things like IIS web apps and anything like that on-prem, you can leverage this to bring those workloads up into the cloud as PaaS services as well. So obviously you can stick with the IaaS option, which is the Windows and Linux, and leave your web apps and your databases here. That's kind of the old school way of doing it. Or you can, start modernizing and bring it up to a PaaS scenario for Azure SQL DB or Azure SQL Managed Instance or web apps. So any flavor of the app services that you have up in Azure, you can take advantage of that as well. And as I said, Azure Migrate is that central hub that will give you access and visibility to all that you need to know about those workloads and assessments as you're moving through the various stages of your strategy. Okay, demo time. Let's see what we can show you folks around Azure Migrate. Okay, so this is Azure. And let's full screen that. Okay, cool. So to get the Azure Migrate service, what you need to do, so if you haven't deployed it or if you haven't configured it, just simply type in migrate up the top search bar, go to Azure Migrate here, and it'll bring you to the overview screen. If you have not created an Azure Migrate project, what you will do is you'll have an option to create it as soon as you land on the overview screen. I've obviously already created a project here, so and I can pivot between projects. I don't need to be stuck just to one specific project. So you can have multiple projects or multiple teams using Azure Migrate as a service for multiple environments. So it doesn't all have to be on one on-prem environment, or even if you've got another cloud environment somewhere else, you can use Azure Migrate and have separate projects for separate data sets that you want and separate workloads. So you can see over here, I'll zoom in a tad just in case anyone needs. So over here on the left, we've got our migration goals, okay? And this is where Microsoft have said, right, what we want to do is we want to deliver server migration scenarios, database migration scenarios, VDI, web apps, and then another one, Data Box. I'll talk about that one in a few minutes. But essentially, you've got a bunch of different services that you can, or different migration goals rather, that you can leverage depending on what your strategy is and what you decide is the best route to go. Maybe in a lot of cases, you're not going to know or not going to be able to make a decision until you perform that assessment phase as well. So if we start with servers, which would be the most common workload that people run on-prem, from a server perspective, when you want to onboard a tool in Azure Migrate, you're going to go and add a tool. So I've not got the Azure Migrate Windows Server one here because I've already added it, but you'll see the various tools in this view here. And you can click on it, add the tool, and then that will add it into the Azure Migrate servers. So Azure Migrate for servers view here. So what I've done is I've just added two from an assessment perspective. I've added the native Azure Migrate server assessment tool and Cloudimize. I've not registered it. I just wanted to show you folks that it can, coexist with third-party vendors here. And quite simply, what we did was we go discover. So we can discover using an appliance. We've got several options. So if you've got a bunch of VMware on-prem, you can select the VMware option and you can download an OVA file. Deploy the OVA file, which is essentially a pre-built VM template. Deploy that to your VMware environment, just so vCenter can see it, and it'll walk you through a very quick and easy wizard where it will then leverage the power of vCenter to extract all of the relevant assessment data that you need. Now, if you're thinking, what if I don't want to use vCenter, I want to go straight to my ESX hosts? Yes, of course, you can do that as well. It's much, much more straightforward, and the data that you get is a little richer when you do use your vCenter deployment as that kind of proxy for the data coming back in. But either way, if you've got VMware, there's an option there for you. Hyper-V, so the demo I've just got a Hyper-V host that I'm using for demos. So what I did was I downloaded, again, 12 gig VHD file, deployed it, same type of scenario, deploys a standard VM template onto my Hyper-V host. The templates, by the way, they don't need to be part of your domain, so they can just coexist as a standard work group server that can be completely siloed from the rest. You don't need to add them into your domain or put any specific credentials in other than, just a one-off local admin for that particular workload. And then, of course, when your assessments are done, you can delete or shut down that server or that appliance, and all should be good. Then you've got not virtualized or other. So there is an option where you can download a zip file, and then you can run a couple of MSIs and PowerShell scripts on a VM. So you might spin up your own virtual machine. Maybe you're restricted to this option because of specific security or hardening features inside your organization, or maybe for whatever reason you just don't feel comfortable downloading an OVA or a VHD from the cloud. So you can just run these files here, and then you can just set up your own appliance, which essentially just runs the same software that the pre-built template would do. If you so wish, if you've no access to the internet from the appliance, so the OVA, VHD, or the server that you run this on, it does need internet connectivity on port 443 outbound. So of course, you're not going to need to bring anything downwards or open up any NAT rules from the cloud in, but you do need outbound 443 SSL or HTTPS communication with the Azure platform. If you cannot get access or permission to outbound internet, you can certainly extract. You can use this import using CSV option. It will download a template CSV file, and then you can pre-populate that with information, with static information about your environment. That's fine in some scenarios. I've used it a few times for customers, but it doesn't give you the real picture. It gives you a very static view instead of a dynamic view. So once we've got our discovery completed, we'll then run our assessment. So we'll go to assess, and in here we can choose what machines we want to assess. Actually, let me just jump back a step, sorry. We'll see when the discovery completes, we'll see the servers that it has discovered. So if I jump in here, I've got a bunch of servers. And if I show you some options here, so in these servers here, we can see that there's a load of them that have been assessed, if you like, that are running on our various different hosts. And we can see here, this fella here, I've installed a dependency module. So you don't have to install dependency module, but if you do, it's an extra agent that gets deployed into the VM. If you do, what Azure Migrate will do, it'll leverage a feature in Azure called Service Map. And the Service Map service will basically explore and identify all of the relevant dependencies that specific virtual machine is communicating with. So I'll get all the information that I need about the specific workload, about the connections. You can see I've got some red connections here, the different ports. And this can be very, very useful when, if like this is clearly, these are just dev test VMs, right? But if this was some random generated name of a server and nobody really knew what it did, maybe it's a legacy one that's sitting in your organization quite a while. And the only way that you know it's important is when you do what we call the scream test. And you basically shut that down and see who screams. And if someone screams, you start to back up. Obviously, that's not a very professional way and a very thorough way of understanding what's important on a specific server. So what we would recommend is you deploy the Azure Migrate with the dependency feature. It gives you this option here, and then quite clearly I can see, well, this is a server, there's all the details on the specific server, and here's all of the different outputs it's communicating with. For example, it's talking to 17 different servers on port 443, and so on and so forth. And from that perspective, we can then make decisions as to understand, as part of our migration strategy, hey, I can't just move that one workload. It has dependencies on other workloads. So I need to move them all together in the form of a group. And if I do that, I'll just jump back a little bit. I can create groups that are specific to my different environments or workload types. Here, we're just doing a little simple test migration group. And we can see here, I've got a bunch of dev test servers. And from there, this could be my initial plan. So maybe these are what we would identify as bronze workloads. And from there, I'm going to say, right, you know what, I'm going to assess these servers. And I would normally hit assess server, but here's one that we built earlier, as they say. And in here, I'm going to say, right, I want to have a look at the readiness of those servers in terms of how ready they are to migrate to Microsoft Azure. So here we can see out of the 6 servers that I've identified in this group, and by the way, the group can contain hundreds of them, I can see that 3 of them are ready and 3 are ready with conditions. I'll find out what those conditions are in a moment. I can see a monthly cost estimate here to run these 6 VMs up in Azure. And I can see that's a total cost, and I can see here a breakdown of just the storage costs based on specific standard hard drives or hard disk drives at the moment that the tool has picked up on. What I can do here on my assessment data, and this is where Azure Migrate becomes really useful if you've got a team, a migration team. So what I can do here is I can go in, I need to recalculate this, but I won't, I'll just show you. For example, I can go in here and I can select the various areas in Azure Migrate or in the assessment that I can tweak. So I might say, you know what, I want to use it as a reserved instance. I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but that's essentially prepaid credit. So I know I'm going to run this virtual machine or this workload. It could be a Azure SQL database or an app service or a storage account, but you might know you're going to run it in Azure for 1 year or 3 years. You prepay for that up front, but then you get significant discounts. Or maybe I only want certain virtual machine sizes in Azure, certain comfort factors, all these different metrics here and different settings you can tweak and you could change. Look, I may as well recalculate it. No, it takes a sec. So we can, you've got the control without having to go back into the original collector machine as such, or assessment machine, and ask it to go back out and recollect or collect more data from the environment. You've got it here where you can just simply tweak the properties, and it uses it as kind of a rudimental CMDB for your migration workloads or your migration data as well. And we can see that's updated now. Let's go back in and show you where I could tweak these. So here I can say, this is a really important one, performance-based or as on premises, okay? So I like this feature a lot, because if I leave this here and I run the collector, the assessment tool on a customer site, I can say I want to run it for a day, a week, a month. And what it will do is it will go off and it will assess, and it will take real live monitoring metrics of things like CPU, memory, disk, your common KPIs as such. And it will then bring back into the Azure Migrate assessment tool, they'll bring that data back, and it will make recommendations to me then based on the Azure virtual machine SKU or type that the Migrate tool thinks I need to use. So, you know, the higher performance you go, obviously the more costly this type of VM would be every month. So I can choose, now I'm never going to go with H series or F series for my customer, for example, but I do want a lucky dip from these depending on what the performance-based criterion comes back with. So again, gives you the flexibility, but it also gives you that knowledge and understanding that, you know, just because you've got a virtual machine, for example, running on your VMware with 64 gig of RAM and 8 CPUs or whatever, 192 gig of RAM and 16 CPUs, doesn't matter. If you've got that on-prem spec like that in a physical box, it doesn't necessarily mean that the actual workload that's running on that box is required or requires that compute power. And this particular setting here will very, very quickly help you identify whether it's over or underutilized for that specific period of time. So that's a really, really good, useful setting there. So let's just jump in a little and we'll have a quick look at why this particular workload is, or some of these are ready with conditions. So I can see this guy here, he's good to go, but the Azure Migrate tool is also saying, hey, you know, here's the standard size that we recommend in Azure. Now I can omit that size if I don't want to, or, you know, based on the monitoring that it's performed, that's what it's recommending. But it's also saying, you know, maybe instead of using the server migration tool and lifting and shifting it, you know, we've identified that, you know, this is a SQL server or has a backend SQL database. Maybe we suggest that you look at the database migration service instead. Down here, we've got things like, okay, an unknown OS. I guess that fella's, he's just turned off. Unknown, so unsupported boot type. So if I click into this fella and I have a look here, so I can see it's ready with conditions. It's giving me another suggested database migration tool because it sees that the SQL Server process is running. And then it's basically just saying, hey, look, you know what, don't worry about that specific issue, because during the migration phase, the Azure site recovery, it's actually Azure server migration, but it's site recovery under the hood. And that particular tool will convert the boot type once it migrates over. So again, it's just giving you a heads up that in its current state, the boot type is EFI, but if you do migrate it, it will automatically sort it out for you. And we can see the different disks and all the different specs that the tool has picked up. Again, from a cost perspective, you can get more of a breakdown here. It'll show you monthly cost on compute, so that's the VM itself. Storage, so any additional disks, like if you've got data disks additional to the VM, it has a breakdown of all that information there. So from an assessment perspective, that's really, really useful, particularly when you're dealing with servers that you're not 100% sure around what they might cost to run up in the cloud. So once you've got all your information ready and you've worked through the different steps in your strategy and you've created your HLD and your LLD and everyone's given the green light to migrate, you can then go in and you can use the Azure Migrate server migration tool, which looks nearly identical, except one is server assessment and one is server migration. From here, it will discover the relevant servers and we can configure different options for replication. Essentially, as I said earlier, this is Azure Site Recovery under the hood. So it's branded as server migration, but it's ASR under the hood. And for this test or this example, I've just created one virtual machine that I've replicated up. So I'm in a scenario where I've created, I've identified, I've agreed with the business that a specific server is the one that I want to move. Sorry, back there. And from there, I performed a test migration. So you can do a test migration. You can basically fail over that virtual machine in a test environment up in Azure. So you can log into it, you can play around with it, make sure it's not blue screening, make sure everything works to the best of your ability, of course. And then when you and the business are good and everyone has signed off on the test, then you can go to the migrate phase. Again, this is only a test VM, but I can actually just hit migrate here and I can choose shut down the VMs before migration or don't, or just let it run, whatever I want to do. And that will migrate over for me. And it will just, in my case, I always shut the VM down. I choose an option not to delete the on-prem VM. So in case things for some reason don't work out, I've got the on-prem one nice and handy. I can quickly just jump back to that one and just reverse the process. But it makes it nice and easy and nice and straightforward for me to do that. And we can see here, this is the server that I've identified, the Hyper-V server that's going to be performing the relevant replications up into Azure. So that's from a server perspective. That's Azure Migrate. Hopefully on that specific area, it's clear and concise for people. If I show you the next phase, so Microsoft are trying to make this as seamless and easily identifiable as possible. So it looks very similar, the database migration to the server migration. So in here, we've got an option to assess again. So if I go to assess, in this scenario, this recommends we download a tool called the Database Migration Assessment Tool, or the DMA. So what we do is, let me flip over to this. So what we do is on the server, we download the DMA tool, run the DMA tool, target it. So I've got two options to create projects on my database server. Now I'm running this on a server that's not a database server, and I can use a remote source on this as well. So it's handy if you've got like a central management or migration server or VM that you want to use for this particular scenario. So in here, I'm going to create, or I have created an assessment that looks at some on-premises databases for me and a SQL instance. So I can see here, it's looking at this specific SQL instance. I've got two options. I've got SQL Server feature parity, and I've got compatibility issues. So feature parity is essentially going to tell me, hey, look, you've got, in this SQL instance, you're running something like maybe SQL Reporting Services. Well, Azure doesn't have a direct equivalent of SQL Reporting Services as a PaaS workload. Yes, you can use Power BI and stuff like that, but if you take that out of the equation, there'll be a recommendation to potentially deploy a VM in Azure with SSRS on it that then connects back to the newly migrated PaaS workload. But this will basically identify at the assessment phase whether or not any features that I have with my on-prem SQL instance are available to in Azure or not. And if I show you here, there's an example of the SQL reporting services. So it says, hey, look, SQL reporting services is not supported in Azure SQL Database. And the SQL Server Reporting Services is a solution for on-prem. And then it gives you a recommendation there where you can see um, the recommendation is install SSRS on an Azure virtual machine. So essentially deploy a VM just with SSRS and then connect that back to the relevant data Azure SQL database paths. If we have a look at compatibility issues, so from this perspective, it's dug a lot deeper. And at this point, this is normally, and again, going back to our strategy where you need to involve all stakeholders relevant to a specific workload. So in this case, I'm going to be working with the database administrators, the DBAs, and we're going to sit down and we're going to have a look at all of the different SQL compatibility modes that this particular database in this particular instance is compatible with up in Azure, because we can choose any of these different compatibility modes. And depending on the compatibility mode, we may have more or less compatibility issues. We can see here migration blockers. So they're the showstoppers that need to be sorted. I normally hand these over to the SQL team and just get them to sort out first. Behavior changes. So it's calling out, hey, look, starting with this, this particular configuration or scenario that you have in this database, this might be a problem, just take it into account. And then it will give you some informational issues as well. So there can be all kinds of issues pop up here. But again, at this early stage, it's really, really useful that, that you can capture this information, that you can give the SQL team that heads up, and everybody is fully understandable of or understanding rather of what's happening and what the potential problems are that need to be rectified first. What you can also do with this tool, which is pretty neat, is you can go up and you can export the assessment. So if you export that assessment, it exports it as a JSON file or a JavaScript object notation file, I think, if I got that right. And a JSON file can be used. So what we use the JSON file from the export assessment feature is that we would export the JSON file and import it into a Power BI instance. And then you can do that with multiple assessments, multiple database assessments. And if you have them in a Power BI instance, I can't show you one here because the only ones I have access to at the moment are customer production workloads. But when you bring it in, you get all those nice donut and pie chart views and drill downs and stuff like that. And it's a nice extra feather in your bow, if you like, when you're sitting down with the business to talk to them about your migration scenario. Then you can create another project here. So when you have all your data, again, we're only focusing on databases. You have all your data, you can go to the migration section or project, select the source, target, the objects, script and deploy schema. You can even select tables. So if there's any custom tables inside the database you don't want to migrate, you can select or choose that and migrate them over. The source is going to be the on-prem workload. The target is going to be essentially an empty Azure SQL paths database, and essentially whatever you select here through the schema and the table data will be what gets imported up to that PaaS workload as well. So ultimately what it looks like, sorry, if I go back here. So up here then we can see, because it's all integrated up into Azure, we can see the data here. There's some databases. That's the specific instance we looked at there. We can see ready for Azure SQL DB. No, not yet, because there's some blockers the DB team need to deliver. If those blockers are too much of a hurdle to overcome, you can always lift and shift it using the server migration feature, and you can bring it up as a VM to get that workload into the cloud, and then make an additional further future project to transform that application into a PaaS workload instead. So you get the idea. You've got your database instances, you've got all your databases, and then it gives you that breakdown where you can get that information nice and easy. VDI, I don't have a full demo here for this one, but just wanted to show some examples. I've added a tool from an organization called Lakeside. You'll need to run through the relevant steps here to register and get that tool if you so want to use this feature. But what the server migration feature has done here is it's identified a bunch of servers. You can see there's a couple of like Citrix Zen servers, and any of these servers essentially that have some form of VDI component on them. It's identified them as potential options if you so wanted to use them. They're just suggestions, so, and obviously we can manipulate this assessment as needed. And then the Lakeside tool, the third-party tool, that will complement this as needed. So then we move into web apps. Web apps, again, you know, this UI is becoming familiar. So in here, what you want to do is you want to assess your web apps. So very similar to the databases, we have a tool called the App Service Migration Assistant. So this tool, I'll jump back into my demo. So this tool here is, this particular one needs to run on the server. So it has some prerequisites around like IIS and stuff like that. So if it's an on-prem database or a database essentially in a VM that's not that you want to migrate, rather, run the tool, the App Service Migration Assistant tool, run that on the actual application server. And then from there, you can select your relevant website. I'll just pick this default website. It performs an assessment. It should just take a sec. Yeah. And then it'll just bring back a bunch of, very similar to the DMA tool, it'll bring back, you know, these are successful, all good here, no warnings. I've got a bunch of errors that I need to figure out here. Now, this is just off one of my old SCOM servers, so there's probably a bunch of areas in there that I'd need to fix up, and app pools and stuff if I wanted to fix it up. But for most of the web applications that we'd work with our customers to migrate, you'd probably only have 2 or 3 errors. And again, once you involve the application vendor and or owner, then the process is fairly straightforward. Once you deliver that, I can't move any further because I've got some errors here, but you know, you log into Azure, you basically connect up to Azure, so it uploads the assessment report to the Azure Migrate service. And then if you wish, you can then use this tool to actually perform the migration. And in a similar vein to the database migration, you will create a new empty app service resource in Azure, and then it will migrate over the relevant data from your on-prem app service up into Azure. So nice and straightforward. It works pretty well. You know, the only gotchas are the ones that are highlighted initially by the tools, and that you need to make sure that you get the relevant members of the teams involved and hands-on so they can fix it up. Last up is Data Box. So I haven't gone all the way through this in the demo because I don't have no need to for a demo as such, but to explain what Data Box is in a nutshell, it's lift and shift of your data. So if you have hundreds of gigabytes or, you know, just large amounts of data, I suppose the size doesn't really matter. It's really down to your WAN link and what kind of pipe size you can transfer data up into Azure with. And if you have a huge amount of data that you feel could take weeks and weeks or even months to push up into Azure if you do it through your normal WAN link, instead what you can do is you can sign up or onboard directly inside. This is an Azure service, it's not a third-party vendor, so you can sign up to Data Box, and we'll select the import to Azure option. We select our Azure subscription. Let's select our resource group, country, good old rainy Ireland, and then our region. So we are lucky that we have a fairly significant and prominent Azure data center in Dublin, and that's the North Europe data center. And if I hit apply here, this starts the chain in motion whereby Microsoft will basically place an order for a courier essentially to come out to my premises with a big, depending on the size I've ordered, a big box, like an external box, storage box. I connect it up to my environment, transfer the data over locally over high-speed connection, go back into the Azure portal, request that the box is collected, and then it's collected and shipped to wherever the data center region is here. Obviously, if the region is a lot further away than your office, you'll incur some delivery costs. But when it gets to the data center, then a Microsoft engineer will be responsible for transferring that data up into your Azure subscription. It's all fully secure and locked down, but it's a neat way of transferring data. And we've done this for a couple of customers so far, and it's definitely been better than the alternative of trying to copy it across. So let me see, back to our deck here. So optimize and control costs. So again, you know, we've walked through how to assess the data, how to perform the migrations. Now we got to understand how we want to optimize and control the costs. So as I said, there is a feature or a service in Azure called Azure Cost Management. In here, it will give you a breakdown of all of the various costs of your environment. You can scope it to management group, which is a governance model hierarchy, or subscription or resource group. So you can get very granular with it as well, which is great when you've got role-based access control or when you've got different cost centers within your organization. You can target Azure tagging as labels as such. So tagging, so all costs with this tag, show me a breakdown. And importantly as well, you can leverage a feature in here called budgets. And Azure Budgets will give you an option to specify, notifications where it says, right, notify me. You can see in the slide here, the red there, for example, in the slide, but notify me if my budget has reached maybe 50%. So my Azure spend has reached 50% in a month of my monthly budget. So maybe give me a quick friendly heads up email. Maybe then you want another budget notification going to land in your inbox, or maybe send you an SMS message when it hits 75%. At this point, you might start panicking. Then you could choose, you know what, when my budget limit hits 100%, that's all we've budgeted for within the organization for this workload in a month. And we've warned the relevant application owners, for example, that they're not to go over that budget. So you could be maybe a little bit mean, but certainly compliant. And you could put some automation in behind the scenes so that when the budget hits 100%, that the relevant workloads are shut down and or even deleted if you wanted to be nasty. But often a shutdown normally stops people from trying to spend anymore. So my point being, it's quite customizable, and it can be as simple as a friendly reminder and a quick heads up that you're approaching your budget, or you could be quite forceful as well. And it will definitely help you integrate with your services and with your migrated workloads going forward. I mentioned earlier about Azure reserved instances. That's the prepay feature. Definitely look into that. It can save you a bunch of money on all kinds of Azure resources if you want to prepay for them upfront. And there's also a feature called Azure Hybrid Benefit, whereby if your organization has access to software assurance on your licensing, well, then essentially you can bring your own license for things like Windows Server and SQL and stuff like that. So there's many, many ways of optimizing costs in Azure. You just certainly need to be aware of them, and don't just take the public Azure calculator pay-as-you-go pricing as the de facto goal for you and your business. And then finally, I'm not going to spend any time on these because we've got some really great sessions coming up, but you've got things like Azure Policy, Azure Management Groups, all types of different governance features and capabilities in Azure that you need to think about. Actually, Bert has a governance session coming up shortly, so check that one out. Security, I mentioned Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel. Either of those two are very worthy contenders for a fairly solid security solution on your Azure workloads. Resiliency, so Azure is built on multiple regions and platforms around the world. You can leverage things like Azure Site Recovery for DR and BCDR, Azure Backup for backups, so you can meet all your BCDR requirements. Monitoring, I'm traditionally a monitoring guy coming from the on-premises SCOM world, so you can still deploy SCOM in Azure on VMs and use that to monitor your environment, or you can use Azure Monitor as well. It's consistently getting better and better and new features, but whatever tool you use, make sure you monitor. And we spoke about automation. There are so many different scenarios for automation up in Azure. And if you can think of an automation scenario, I guarantee that you can achieve it without a huge amount of additional effort as well. Okay, so I think we're probably just pretty much on the button. So I'll finish up for now. I hope that this was quite useful. And if there's any questions, I can hang around and we can chat about them. And if we don't get them covered in the time slot allocated, what we can do is we can take it offline on Twitter or LinkedIn. It's not a problem.
All righty, Kev. Yeah, definitely questions. So brace yourself. Well, I'll just start at the top, man. So you did great session. I managed to finish an entire flask of Irish breakfast tea while I was watching you here, because it's too early for Irish whiskey.
Never too early. So
let's start with, how would we migrate VMs from AWS?
So there's a feature. So essentially, right? So if you're migrating from AWS, there's a feature in Azure Migrate. You might have remembered where we could choose a collector. So we had a collector option for VMware. Sorry, not well, the collector was the assessment, right? So it's also known as configuration server. So you have one for VMware, for Hyper-V, or for physical servers. And essentially, AWS, Google, whatever, just treat them as physical servers. So in that specific scenario, it's the physical server scenario, regardless of the platform that they're sitting on. And once you treat it like that, it doesn't matter where it's coming from.
Great. Next, any service or document available to migrate on-premises Hadoop to Azure?
Any document available to migrate on-premises Hadoop to Azure? No, not a scenario I've come up with, but if you leave it with me, keep that question aside, Pete, and I'll do some digging and see what I can find out.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. Does Azure migrate all the DB objects when I'm migrating the databases? For example, I have stored procedures, views, global temp tables, and all users. Do all of those things move as part of the migration?
So they can if they're supported, and we've had scenarios where it's actually custom stored procedures are definitely areas that can be a challenge, and it can pop up. So we did one large deployment, or sorry, migration for a customer last year, and it was actually stored procedures that caused a lot of the headache as well. So, but then others worked fine. So normally what we do is we lean on the assessment tools. And if the assessment tool calls it out, you got to put your thinking hat on. You got to work with the DBA and sort it out. Obviously, back up everything before you make any changes, just in case. But it will essentially take the data. It doesn't strip it out of what's on-prem. The only time stuff gets stripped out is if your DBA wants to fix the problem that's being highlighted by the assessment tool and they actually remove it. But the migration tool doesn't strip the data out. It just essentially synchronizes or copies it over to a new empty Azure SQL database.
Oh, there you go. Okay, fantastic. Does Azure, bear with me here, does Azure support migrating AWS Redshift to Azure Synapse? So that's data warehouse, Azure Synapse. So
yeah, so again, not a scenario in little old Ireland that I come across too much, or I've seen myself. But so I suppose if you're looking at what Microsoft currently have in the Azure Migrate service in terms of migration scenarios, so they don't have a specific migration scenario there for that. So I would expect if there was like a swing kind of migration style, they'd have it in alongside the VDI and the web apps and stuff. What I can say is, I'm not saying it can't be done, I've just not experienced that particular scenario, but what I can say is that they are adding new migration scenarios all the time, and a lot of them are in if you like, context to what the relevant competitors are delivering as well.
let's see, has Azure Monitor matured enough to replace SCUM? So I'll get your opinion, Kevin. This is one we should probably ask a few folks today.
Yeah, there you go. So I'd say I don't think I've been to a presentation or a conference in the last 4 years that I haven't been asked that question. So in my opinion, no, it hasn't matured to a point that it will, or that it is currently ready to replace SCUM. If you've got, like, if you think of the richness of what SCUM has in terms of not just in the Microsoft ecosystem, so like when you dig into all of the relevant Microsoft workloads, think of something simple like certificate monitoring. Your friend Pete Raphael wrote a great management pack a few years ago, for monitoring certificates inside on-prem, well, inside VMs anywhere. It's like a dark art trying to get that info using Azure Monitor at the moment. So I think it's a long way away. It's not to say that you should discount Azure Monitor, because Azure Monitor, particularly for Azure resources, is very powerful and very useful. So what we normally recommend to customers is, keep with your SCUM if you've got it. If you're considering upgrading SCUM 2019 is looking nice and slick. We've got quite a number of customers that are still definitely on the SCUM journey, and we're obviously always happy to work with them. And what we encourage people to do is to onboard what we call Azure attached scenarios. So leverage something like one of the connectors in SCUM 2019 to connect up to Azure Log Analytics, and then to integrate the Azure management pack, so that the actual Azure resource management pack. There's a
Mhm.
new one that I saw Microsoft announce the other day, like there's Azure SQL Managed Instance. You know, like the development time is still going into the Azure attached scenarios for SCOM. So to answer that in a long-winded way, it's not there yet, but you know, they are adding new features in Azure Monitor every single month nearly, you know, so it'll at some point, I guess it probably will get to that, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I'm going to give you one more. Bear with me. Sorry. Can we migrate our on-premises data warehouse to Azure Synapse with your tools?
So again, there's no direct scenario for as in like the Synapse service, right? But and you can see with Azure Migrate, so from the database and even the app service integration, it's not directly as seamless as say the server migration because that was the first scenario that they approached and that they integrated. So with the app service and the database scenarios, you still got to download those separate tools and you still got to run those tools and validate whether they conform and whether they're relevant or not. So as far as I know, actually, you can use the I'm not a SQL ninja now, but you can use, I think there's a feature in SQL Management Studio that performs some sort of assessment on your databases and data warehouses that can also then just migrate or move that database or data warehouse up into Azure. Now, whether there's a Synapse version, I don't know. It's not my specialist area, to be honest, but I can certainly try and find out if it's a pressing question someone has for it.
Yeah, so Kevin, I'm gonna stop it there, and there are just so many questions here. I'm going to move those offline, and
Cool.
I'll follow up with an email, and we can capture those for the after. But I have the names that go with those questions, so we should be able to funnel those back to
Super.
the askers. And lots of thanks for you, Kevin. I just see more questions, more than questions. I see just thank yous pouring in here. So.
Brilliant.
Fantastic session, as we expected it would be. Thanks again for agreeing to join us.
You're very
And
welcome. I'll be shifting around on the sidelines on and off over the rest of the evening anyway, Pete. So if you see me there, I'll be listening in.